So there's a lot to study in terms of demographics of Rio de Janeiro. I wanted to just start off by taking a quick look at where Rio is, so you can kind of get an idea. Basically, it's right here. And the interesting thing is it's not actually located right on the tip here of what you might think of Brazil, but it's actually a little bit south of that point. So as you can tell, this circle here shows where Rio is, and the tip of what you might expect of Brazil is a little bit different. But originally, back in before the 1900s, a lot of the population actually came from Europe and hit that tip first, and then down to Rio and Sao Paulo, and even further south later on. So most of the people in Brazil live in this basic area that you're looking at here. And certainly it's very complex, Sao Paulo to Rio, and you can kind of see all of South America, and that's a whole big discussion in itself, but I kind of circled certain areas that I think would be more interesting to look at. And I wanted to really focus on the downtown Rio, and unfortunately it just takes forever to load all the three-dimensional views of everything here, but especially just my brother's a geologist, and I just wanted to really take a look at these mountain ranges here, and I want to pan around here so you can just kind of see the demographics. And you can kind of remember from some of the other stuff we've been talking about, essentially where the people are. But there's certain blocks and certain areas that we kind of want to study in a little more detail. But I just wanted to get an overview here. So let's take a look around here. Now, kind of in the background here, you can kind of see this mountain in the center here, and that certainly changes the whole entire, essentially what's going on in Rio. And you can kind of see in the background here, there's a whole nother area kind of off there, and certainly even some kind of secret ways to get through some of these hills, right? But anyway, so you can kind of see here what's been going on, and I'll try to zoom in here, see if we can get the 3D view to start working a little bit better. But the airport you can kind of see right here, and the downtown. So to kind of put things in perspective, Brazil is the sixth most populated country in the world, and certainly it has been growing fast since about the 1900s, as you can see in this graph. There's kind of two waves. You can see here, basically about 1950, things really started to pick up as well. And certainly it's a big debate in terms of what's going on with the population. You can kind of see some different variations in the curves here if you look very carefully. And maybe I'm slightly wrong on some of these, but certainly interesting to think about in terms of the inflection points. So in this study, we're going to try to look at just about all of Rio, and it's excuse me, it's very complex, and certainly I'm not an expert on this, but there's a lot of things to look at even outside of Rio, and you might look at these other cities kind of in the peripheral, and that would kind of explain a lot of really fine details about essentially how Rio is growing out further away into kind of like farming areas that probably are going to become extremely important in Brazil's future in the next 20 or 100 years in terms of how we feed the world. Classically Sao Paulo, one of the reasons it was so big is because it was kind of a farming area. And still to this day, it's about almost supposedly twice the size of Rio. I would say maybe, if Rio's say 12 million, Sao Paulo's a little bit above, say 20 million. So kind of give you a rough estimate on numbers here. So one of the funny things you might ask is that if you're not Brazilian, who are you? And I found this data, and it looked pretty interesting and accurate, I guess. But If you're not Brazilian, you might be Portuguese, obviously, but it's interesting to see that although Brazil is Portuguese speaking, there's quite a lot of Italians in Brazil and also just Spanish people, and as well as Germans and even indigenous people. So this is kind of like of the others. So it's kind of a breakdown of these groups. So and you can see that there's actually quite a number of Africans here, and even more Africans, say, than Spanish, for instance, or Germans, as you might expect. But anyway, but just kind of interesting to see the different breakdown here. So I'm not sure if this is a totally accurate statement, but if you were to kind of find out like where are the Brazilians from, you might think of it that way, and a lot of them are, basically just 100% from Brazil, but quite a number are from Portugal, and that kind of should make sense, right? Like you speak Portuguese, you're in Portugal, in Lisbon, and hey, there's this gigantic country called Brazil. Let's go to Brazil. So there's a lot of Portuguese there, about 8%, and it's actually I would say it's kind of a surprising small number. Just from my like guess, I would say, hey, if I was in Portugal and man, Portugal's kind of small. Why not just go to Brazil? So, and then there's quite a number of Italians. So that number is particularly interesting. If I was doing demographics, I'd be very interested in that, just kind of the history there. And then kind of a relatively small number of Spanish people. I mean, Portuguese and Spanish is a very similar language. Surprising number of Germans. I guess there's kind of like a colony in the south of Brazil that's German, and then an extremely small percentage of indigenous. And actually, that's a kind of a concern. You might say, what's going on in the jungle, and this kind of thing. And I think a lot of the indigenous people probably, the jungle is hard to live in. And I think a lot of them moved out to Venezuela. There's kind of like a secret little valley area that you can kind of, or even another Amazon River up in Venezuela. And it could be that a lot of them moved there, or even into the Caribbean or Colombia, obviously. And those are just great places, high mountain towns and cool kind of places. But anyway, and then there's a significant number of Africans and then others and so on. But certainly very interesting data here to look at and help understand all of Brazil and kind of get us started in Rio. So that number, approximately 65% or so, is a little bit hard to understand. So you kind of got to look at it in terms of these numbers, and you can kind of see better that these are smaller percentages of the total population. And it gets kind of complicated. The numbers are maybe more than 100% because, different. You could be Portuguese and Brazilian at the same time, so you could be from Portugal and so on. But anyway, so surprisingly, or maybe so, 19 in the 1940s, average Brazilian had about 6 kids per woman, and today it's a little under about 1.7 or so. So quite a big change between the 1940s. That's only about 60, 80 years or so that change has taken place. And again, before we get into the real details here, you can kind of see some of the reason why Rio de Janeiro is a little bit different than the rest of Brazil, and it's actually very different, right? So, actually, most of Brazil is up in the north and basically jungle, and that's very hard to live in. And then there's also kind of a strange, kind of a mid-mountain area. It's even kind of dry, surprisingly, but anyway, but basically the thing that makes Rio so awesome is basically all the mountains in the background. These are not super large mountains, but they're pretty spectacular, and making Rio one of the best cities in the world. So the map you're looking at here is what's called the Columbia gridded world map, and it's a GPW map, actually. They have version 4 of it out, and that's for 2020. And this is the latest and greatest and most detailed map that you or anyone else can really have of the area, or really of the whole entire Earth. And it's pretty nice because you can kind of zoom and pan around and take a look at details. But I kind of trust this data because it's done by the university here, and they've been working on this for a number of different years. They've have at least 20 years of data, pretty high resolution of all over the world. So it's pretty nice to take a look at. Driving in, into downtown Rio in the morning here, basically out from this area in the suburbs, would probably come in through this road. And I'm just going to turn on roads here so you can see. You can kind of see this big yellow road kind of heading out there, and then this guy heading in here, and then as well as this guy coming along here. So, but this is certainly one of the main kind of avenues. And you can see there's this kind of pretty interesting like church kind of structure here. And certainly that is very notable, perhaps one of the most notable buildings in terms of defining what's going on. If you're driving in and kind of trying to understand what was going on in Rio down this road. So next, what I wanted to do is kind of look at this other area, and it's basically if you zoom out here, you can see what we're gonna do. So we were kind of looking at this kind of road through here heading into downtown. And the other area is basically this other side of Rio. And you can kind of see right around here. So basically it's this whole kind of area, and even heading out to the beaches and stuff. So I'm kind of going to skip around a bit here, but we're going to start off by looking at just a quick detail snapshot. I have some general overview of all Brazil, but I wanted to look at this first. And then also I got a three-dimensional view kind of as well. So that's later on here, but we'll start off with this. Kind of zoom into Rio, and certainly, for a more full picture of what's really going on in terms of solving the problem of population and just having more people live in nice areas. Essentially, we would have to look at how to move this big chunk of people out to essentially in this area, or even over to this Niterói area. So, in the long term, this is just a lot of suburbia and even pollution from the mountain areas kind of collecting in here. And it's going to be a big question in the next 100 years. And believe it or not, that's pretty recently in terms of how to kind of move this population, and even some of these areas out here that are probably going to be pretty cool farming towns. I think it's possible to have smaller cities in the suburban area that are really cool and fun. But at a certain point, it gets polluted and just too many, so you kind of have to be careful. But there's certainly a possibility to have, like mini airports to get out to the farms and then back into Rio and so on. But I'm not an expert on the farming situation in Brazil, but certainly is a very interesting discussion. I'd love to kind of look at more details on this. But in essence, what happened is that with the Olympics coming to Rio, a lot of new houses were built kind of in this area. And actually, I'm not even sure exactly the area, but essentially along the coast, they tried to build Olympic housing. So, what I wanted to do is kind of look at kind of a particular area near the downtown, and kind of explore what's going on here. So, basically, what you can see is we're kind of zooming in here now. The yellow areas are the most populated, and then you have kind of the orange, which are almost as populated as the yellow areas, and then the red, and then kind of going out to out in the water here where it's not populated at all. So the question that I kind of asked myself when I started studying the demographics, certainly I'm very interested in Nitzroy and actually this city over here, and then just further like what's going on in the future of kind of this coastal region. So there is a bridge that you can kind of get across to the town of Nitzroy here from Rio. It is kind of hard. I've looked at some of the highway maps, and they don't really have very good highway infrastructure, which is in some ways is great because then it means that they have to create a train system of some sort. And there's a lot of big cities like New York, in Manhattan, where basically people live and never even own a car, and that would be awesome to see Rio become a city like that. Certainly, it's complex, but it could actually. For example, they could use some of the infrastructure that they've used to build kind of trains, kind of the metro here, which was pretty difficult to use about 10 years ago. But they built some new lines in, and what would be interesting is kind of building some trams in addition to that up into the hills. So there's some places like in South America, like in I won't name some towns, but they basically have built these trams to get up into the high mountain towns. So it's kind of funny because what they're doing in Rio, essentially, is they're building, outside of some of these these smaller towns up in the hills that people have kind of gotten free housing. They've kind of built new housing down in the foothills and kind of said, "Hey guys, move to these new houses if you move out of the hills." And I think it might have been better to just move further up into the hills and do like a tram system, because I think it's kind of the whole downtown of Rio is kind of in a bad location in general. I mean, a lot of people may never even go to downtown Rio. If they go to Rio, they may just stay in Copacabana or Ipanema or Leblon. So part of the problem is, just the working. It's not. It's not a. I mean, this is very close to one of the best cities in the world, and just a really fun place to live. So, a lot of people say, "Hey, what's the deal with all this work?" But there is some very important businesses in downtown Rio, some of the largest in the world, in fact, and because it's a great place to live. So, but back to the original thing is here we're trying to say like what's really going on. With the demographics here, and so I'm actually pretty familiar with this area, and I was just shocked at how kind of like plain this area is. It's a lot of we're going to look at some buildings and see what's going on here, but you'll be surprised. These multi-level houses sometimes means for like kind of a boring lifestyle. This is just house after house or apartment after apartment for 10, 20, 30 floors up into the air, and it's just square kind of design. So, that's kind of one truth here. And there is, at least 10 years ago, there was a lot of abandoned buildings. You'd just be shocked. You can get, I won't say prices, but anyway, so you can basically see, but one of the areas that I'm not familiar with, but I'm vaguely familiar with, is kind of this area, just outside of the downtown area, and it certainly is very interesting because if you want a job in Rio and you're trying to work, you probably want to walk to work. Like many of the lifestyle in New York, or if you have a real job that you don't hate the commute, and you're probably wanting to walk to work. It basically means there's very few areas. So if you looked at this bigger picture, when you zoom out, essentially, this from here to here is like 20 miles or so, maybe 30. And forgive me if I'm wrong. This says 4 miles, so this is like 410. So yeah, 20. But this is not high-speed highways, and certainly 20 miles in very dense population of 12 million people, and you can say probably 70% of them live maybe in this area, right? So that's a lot, and this is certainly different. When you have a lot of people trying to get on the road and off the road, not everybody works downtown and so on. So, but there's just so much to say about this whole demographics, and this kind of stuff in here. This is a whole kind of another question. And certainly, some of this lowland and right on the beach. Again, the beach is not the only reason why you want to live there. And as you get further and further out, that's kind of the sense I got. It becomes almost a solely just a beach community. So there's basically, different areas here. So I want to show you a couple images for what it looks like in three-dimensional view, and you'll be for some reason because it has all these funny little dots on it. Just because sometimes there's little towns, and that you kind of have to see. So here you can kind of see what's going on, right? So this is São Paulo here. Here's Rio, and this is Brasilia out here. And then this point out here is Recife. So you can kind of see, there's quite a lot of people living out here, but this whole area is very flat and jungly, and gets complex. And then you can see some really strange developments, even heading out towards Colombia and Venezuela, and even pretty large cities, out that way. But a lot of this being out along the Amazon, and Manaus being here. But going back to Rio here, you can kind of see it's not so sure that everyone's trying to move into Rio. Certainly, there's some other cities, even Belo Horizonte. From what I understand, the weather's pretty good there, higher altitude and so on. Basically, like California, you get around. And then if you want to be right on the ocean, though, basically you got Rio and Santos and Curitiba. And forgive my pronunciations, but and just some strange developments out towards Paraguay. I've heard that you can buy stuff cheap out towards these areas, but whatever that means. And even down towards Uruguay, you can kind of see a pretty thin slice into here. So. But in general, you can see that actually not a whole lot of cities here, but then a couple cities heading up here, and then kind of quieter area. So a lot of that is because the cool mountains kind of come into this part. There's some cool, it looks really beautiful along the coast here, whereas up here it gets a little bit more flat for some reason, even though it comes out so significantly here in this point. So this map is super interesting. In general, you can kind of see what's going on. There's such a discussion in terms of where you live, why you live there, and just different details. But certainly this map really, to me, was super awesome and interesting. And so if you kind of simplify that map into millions of people in each one of those regions, you can kind of see what's going on. So there's basically a lot of people in Rio. It's the most highly densest population in all of Brazil, even denser than Sao Paulo. And some of that is because of the mountain areas and just making it tight to fit in housing, and spectacular views as well. But you can kind of see there's also a pretty heavy population in the south of Brazil. I've traveled to south of Brazil. I didn't really notice it in particular being super heavily populated there. But certainly this map gets you started on that details. So you can kind of see this map, surprisingly, is from the 1960s, kind of showing the demographics. And you can kind of see that there was quite a lot of people up on the tip of Brazil, and you'd be very surprised how many large cities, and we mean super large, in the many millions of people there are still to this day outside of Rio. Rio is huge, and in some ways Rio's got a lot of suburbia to it, unexpectedly, that a lot of people might not realize. And here's kind of the population density map. You can kind of see there's just a little blip there, just kind of on the tip also, and then basically Rio being the densest and most populated, densely populated area in Brazil. So this is a very important map to kind of get us started here, showing the numbers of people in each of the major cities. So we're primarily going to talk about Rio, but as you can see, Sao Paulo is certainly the largest city, and it's on a whole another level. This is a log graph, so you're basically talking about 10 million plus, heading towards 15 million in Rio, and certainly above 20 million or on that edge of 20 million in Sao Paulo. So just pretty different cities, and in some ways, Sao Paulo is a little bit easier to understand than Rio, just because of the geography. Rio kind of has a lot of spill out into the suburbs, as we mentioned, and certainly much more complex because it's kind of limited by the coast in terms of where it can expand. So I really like this graph a lot. It kind of gives you perspective of what we're talking about. So you can see Rio is basically about 5% of the total population in Brazil. So certainly there are a lot of people living in other cities than the cities that we listed here. I mean, given the population of 212 million people or so, basically most people, everyone else in Brazil, about approximately 70% of the people live in other cities. But Sao Paulo is huge. 5% say for Rio, maybe 7 or 10% in Sao Paulo of the total population. But just kind of gives you an idea. And here you can basically see all of those largest cities in Rio. And you might imagine a lot of people wanting to move in from suburbs if they had a choice. A lot of them are either going to Sao Paulo or Rio. And then you can also see some other ones like Brasilia having a pretty large percentage. That's their capital. And also Recife and Belo Horizonte, which is kind of an inland area, and then Porto Alegre. But certainly these other ones, it's kind of mysterious. Visited some of them, and I was very surprised at the styles of each of the cities that are significantly smaller relative to, say, Rio or Sao Paulo. And certainly there's a very big difference between Rio and Sao Paulo in terms of style. So these numbers are specific for Rio de Janeiro, and I was just a little bit surprised. More women than men by a significant percentage, and also quite a number of kids in Rio. So you can see maybe almost 20% of the population of Rio is between the age of 0 and 14, which is quite surprising. I was extremely surprised by numbers in India, how young India is, and other countries like this, but certainly Rio is also pretty young. But there's also a sizable percentage of about maybe say 10% people age 65 and older, and but most people between the age of 15 and 65. So here's a population pyramid, and the population is about the same as it was, but you can kind of see that most of the people are kind of in this age group of basically 10 to about 40 years old, and you can see that it's after 40 it like quickly drops down, and but before that, it's kind of a little bit biased. So basically, there's essentially younger population, under 30 typically, or 35, and that's basically, you could say 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, about 50, about 100 million or so. Roughly half or a little bit more than half of the population is uh, well, anyway, it's just an estimate, but basically, just give you an idea. This. So I'm not exactly sure how to read this graph, but essentially you can kind of say if you look at each one and then compare that to the total population of about 215 million people, you can kind of get an understanding here. So for the European example, there's approximately 75 million of the 215 million, so 75 of the 200 say million people are European. So that's basically about one in every two. And then you can kind of see the multiracial and the other percentages here. But this is particularly for the population 0 to 14 and 15 to 49. So it's kind of interesting to start off by looking at the demographics, and you can see that basically there's quite a lot of mixed race, Africans, and even Asians, and even more Asians than the Native Americans. So just kind of interesting to look at the basic numbers here. So we're going to go into a lot of details here, but this was a super interesting map, just kind of looking at the demographics. And it's kind of hard to read this. So Preta is black and Parda is brown and Branca is white. So in some senses, the green is kind of mixed, and the red is basically black, and the blue is white. So you can basically see, a lot of up into the hills region is kind of brown, and then there's certain areas that are basically black. And I just wanted to kind of look at the actual satellite imagery so you can see the same area. And of course, it helps to really zoom out on all of Rio to see what's going on. And it may be a little bit hard to see, but basically what we're talking about here is that this area, which it shows kind of a forested area, that was the area that didn't have any population supposedly, and then there's kind of this area in here which was like kind of brown, and then there was kind of a black area right in here, and let's kind of just zoom in to see so you can see what's going on there. And it's a little bit hard to see this, so I'm just gonna bring in the map that I had from before and kind of show you on top of this if I can. So basically, let's move this over a little bit, see if I can get this all on one page. But basically, so this is basically Copacabana, right? And you can kind of see what's going on here. A little bit hard to see. So it may have been, it may help to actually zoom in and see, but basically you can kind of get an idea for what's going on in terms of the demographics, at least in this little region of, very important region of Rio. And of course, just want to stop off with a quick demographic map of Rio de Janeiro. Of course, you saw the location of Rio. It's right here, and it kind of has a bay. And I'm not too familiar with how this bay works, but it's not a typical bay like, say, San Francisco Bay Area or even, Boston's Bay, so on. But basically, you're talking about a 20-mile stretch. So from the tip there out to the edge is maybe say 20 miles, 30 or so, and kind of give you a basic idea for the population, and you can kind of see all the little cities coming out into Rio, and basically kind of heavily off on the western side. And one of the reasons is because that route is out to Sao Paulo, and also some flat land and farmland in that area. And here's kind of a cool little map just to show you Sao Paulo here on the left and then Rio on the right. And you can kind of see how you might travel from Sao Paulo to Rio, and that being quite common. And then there's another little city there off on the left there called Santos. But basically, you can see that 20 miles distance. I've took a bus from Sao Paulo to Rio. It was very interesting, and it's very green. But anytime you take your first bus in a foreign country, it can be very interesting. But interesting to see Rio here. It's got all the different kind of neighborhoods, and you can see some of the more populated ones here. And I'll just click on one to give you an example. But basically, this guy right here being pretty populous for a number of uh, for a lot of people in this area. So basically, um, it's kind of hard because you can't really always say just based on because some of these regions are huge, and then the population density may be more of a factor in some sense. Is in here on the downtown area, and of course there's some other areas here in Flamingo, and believe it or not, I actually used to live in this area. And it was it did feel almost a little bit too residential relative to some living situations, say for example in San Francisco, kind of a positive residential feeling. But anyway, so this area I kind of wanted to look at in a little bit more detail, and then also kind of back out and just see what else we could kind of discover here. You can see there's kind of a little bit of a residential area over here, and that actually turns out to be quite close to the airport. There's or not airport, sorry. Yeah, I think there's another airport over here. Yeah, so but uh, but anyway, there's some little pockets here that may be interesting. And when you're thinking about living in Rio or just the demographics, it is nice to think about where you get the fresh air, and also where the nice views are. So there's a lot of different things to think about, and then also close proximity to work, right? So if a lot of work is downtown, how do you actually get in there? So there's a lot of things to look at and compare. But essentially, what I wanted to do is take a look at this, right? So we kind of see what's going on here, right? So we got downtown Rio, and excuse me, right? So we basically got this downtown Rio area, and then we kind of have a couple areas that we just want to look at in detail. So one of the things is that on that bigger view, right, when we zoomed out, a lot of the rest of the population is out this way. So by understanding this side of Rio, we basically get into like Flamingo. I'm pretty familiar with. You get to basically understand how Copacabana works and Leblon and the rest of them. But particularly for the quote-unquote real jobs in Rio and what's really going on, you have to kind of get to this intersection of where this whole population kind of comes into this population and this population, right? And then even that backside. So basically, this area turns out to be, let me see. So you can kind of see this vague little spot here, and that is the same thing as this guy, right? So if we go back to this, you can kind of see what's going on here, right? So you got another little circular area. Let's see if we can find it. And you kind of see the population here of Rio and kind of heading off out to Sao Paulo. So, if you combine Niterói, which is the city just off to the right of Rio there, or the east, I guess, from Rio across the bay, and you add that, and you kind of get almost the size of Sao Paulo. But certainly there's a lot of other cities heading out kind of north and west of Sao Paulo, as you see that little line there. And then little cities in between Rio and Sao Paulo as well. This is this spot right here, right? And then if you follow that road down and you take a little bit of a turn and you go into here, you get this other area. But there's a lot of population right in here and right in here and kind of off in this range. So we want to kind of take a quick look at that area, right? So you can see that this is this area here, and you got the population in here, and so on. So let's go back and let's just zoom in and kind of see what's going on right in this area, because this is one of the most important. Okay, so here you can kind of see what's going on, right? So you got this Central Park area over here, and then kind of that little circular area, and then kind of some housing development in through here, and then this other circular area here, right? So back in this, it's a little bit hard to see that, but you can kind of see this, right? And so there's this little intersection here and here, and it seems like, if you wanted to be in the center of that, you'd kind of be right around there. So let's just see how close we can zoom into that. So you can kind of see what's going on here. And I think this is like a big supermarket here. So that would be a pretty important supermarket for all of Rio de Janeiro, really. And then, of course, this kind of building and so on. And just another map here to kind of put this all in perspective with the rest of South America. And here you can kind of see Rio just with the road maps. So to kind of get us started here, the main area that most people know about Rio is kind of this light blue area. And then there's kind of the other area of Rio, kind of more suburban, heading out towards, say, Sao Paulo and so on. But from this map, you can kind of see that the yellow areas are the highest density, and then you get the lowest density are kind of darker colors there. So but you can kind of see a couple details. We're going to zoom in and just take a look here at the downtown area, and then also the Copacabana and Ipanema, that area. So here's a zoom in right along the beach, and you kind of see most of the people live in Copacabana, and you can kind of see, every area has its own unique and cool areas. There's certain hills, mountains, and cleanliness also. But here's basically a view. Let's also look at a satellite view image really quick. You see Copacabana, Ipanema, and Leblon, the same areas. And there's this kind of a cool little lake here. And of course, there's a lot of different areas here. So you can see that population, that dense part of the population back in kind of suburban Rio heading out into this way. But the downtown that most people are familiar with is over here. However, certainly there's a lot of people living here in Copacabana. So you might ask, obviously this is a pretty tough commute over some weird ranges to get into downtown Rio de Janeiro. But there's a lot of other stuff, even heading out to Leblon and so on. You can kind of see what's going on here all the way down the coast. But basically give you a basic idea, and let's even head over to Niterói here across so you can kind of see. And basically Niterói on the other side here. So, but anyway, cool way just to compare basically the ArcGIS maps with the Google Maps. And you kind of see downtown Rio here and some of the areas. So kind of in this area, Flamingo, there's a lot more people living. And then there's kind of this little area just kind of in the hill, just before the hills up into Santa Teresa. But you can kind of see these areas here, basically in this area and then out in here. Kind of another perspective of Rio, kind of from the downtown area. So you can see, basically a flood of people kind of back in this area, right? And then even over here in Niterói, or I can't pronounce the name, but anyway, you can basically see, or kind of just zooming in here to see that's the city. So basically, at nighttime, you can't really, a lot of people don't really live downtown. And it's kind of interesting that Rio hasn't done anything about this in terms of, they built the airport here right next to downtown. But this vast suburban sprawl, they could have worked pretty heavily on kind of, rebuilding even Flamingo and some other areas. But it's interesting to see basically the perspective here for. So here's basically all the sources and references that I've used for this, and I'm not sure if this is even going to work right, but basically, if you're interested in kind of the free population data, and let me just see if I can load that up here, which probably won't work. But this map, let me bring it over here. This map right here is that map. And you can kind of get that data from this link, and it has the exact latitude and longitude. And I have all my spreadsheet data, all those graphs, those cool pictures and things that you can get from this. And then there's also this ArcGIS stuff that was pretty great. It's right here. And then you have the demographics of Brazil. So there's a lot of data that is kind of gotten from other data, and you can get the sources from that. Slightly different than just the Brazil Wikipedia page. So you do have to kind of dig to find this one. So I recommend this demographics first. And then there also list Brazilian states by population density. There's a separate link for that. And of course, you got some awesome color maps by race. So there's just some other data and research papers that I've read on these various topics, and they're super interesting. I recommend taking a look at some of those. And basically, if you're interested in population of Rio in specific, there's some here information there, some other heat maps, and basically this is something I tried to get working, couldn't get working for this presentation, but Colombia has this population data per kilometer, and they actually released it for this recent year, 2020, and it looked really awesome. And some guy was able to get it supposedly working with Google Earth, and that would be really cool to see 3D models on top of the maps of population down to 1 kilometer. So anyway, these are kind of the links. And sorry, it's a lot here, but hopefully each and every single one of them was used and helpful.